Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare. My name is Katherine Troyer, and joining me is Anthony Tresca.
Hey there!
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so excited to have you be joining us today for our discussion over 1992's classic Candyman.
I find myself, and we talked about this very briefly before we started recording, I find myself liking this film almost despite itself, despite some of, I think, what are some very serious problems in terms of representations of race, but also just in terms of like narrative and some of the things that I often criticize other films for. I'm willing to forgive in this film, and I haven't quite figured out why that is the case, but ultimately I really rather like this film.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you've said. This is also not the first time I've seen this film. I remember when I first watched it, I found it kind of boring, actually, and I was like, I guess it's got some interesting things to talk about, but overall, I was not consistently entertained, and I don't know. It just wasn't my cup of tea. I thought it was okay. I really liked the score. I remember that even from the first time around. Just really loving the score, but I wasn't super impressed with anything else. However, on this rewatch, I'm thinking about it in a very different light.
For me, one of the things I really like about this film is the amount of conversation that it always delivers.
Yeah.
I'm thinking very specifically about when we taught this film in our home and horror class, and it was, at the point in the spring 2020 where everyone was pivoting to remote teaching for higher education and all forms of education, and it was really
due
hard
to COVID,
to get
yeah.
due to COVID and like 2020 being just the worst year ever, and understandably everyone had so many other things on their mind, and there was a real dip in the conversation level of pre online pivot and post-online pivot. But the one sort of like weird blip on the radar was our discussion of Candyman. I would argue that it was actually maybe one of the best conversations that our class had the entire semester long, because there's just something about this film that pulls you in and makes you have questions and makes you have thoughts and makes you just have things that you need to say.
Well,
and that's...
I think it's because it's ultimately, and I think I do know why I liked it. Why, in spite of itself, I like this movie so much. It's because I think it's discussing such an interesting subject matter, and I think it particularly relates to university students and anyone involved in academia, because it is about academics in a city doing academic things, and academics are in a horror film. So yeah, I don't think it's super surprising that people at a university in a big city like where we taught this class really related and had a lot of things to say about this film. Because, I mean, everybody recognizes, like, oh yeah, there are certain neighborhoods in the big cities that the city has just let go, and it's just totally been, people in those communities have been left to just fend for themselves, and there's its own kind of martial law there, in a sense, and it's very recognizable.
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct, and the fact that this film and the themes that it is exploring remain just as, if not more relevant 30 years after the fact, is I think one of the reasons that this film just remains so important and so valuable, and it's one of the reasons why I'm so devastated that the somewhere between a remake and an adaptation of Candyman has been postponed for another year, because I really would be interested in seeing where we go next, considering that everything about this film, the 1992 film, still feels so very relevant.
Yeah, I mean, it's looking back at history, and any history, and obviously the art that was made in that history, it really is kind of sad how little has changed, and how issues that were being brought up in the 90s regarding race and regarding the disparity that exists, and this really is talking about the systematic inequality that exists and perpetuates in our society, and how that's still here 28 years later when we're talking about it in 2020.
That's an excellent segue, this idea of looking at the sort of trajectory or history of things for the scholarship that I want to make sure that we use as a way of framing and thinking about Candyman. And this comes from the excellent book Horror Noire, which was also made into a documentary on Shudder. But the book Horror Noire, subtitle of Blacks in American Horror Films from the 1890s to Present by Dr. Robin Means Coleman, is a fantastic book, just sort of period. But one of the things that I really appreciate about the way that she explores her subject is that she gives us a really clear framework for how we can understand what it means to say that blacks have been in American horror films since the 1890s. And she says that there's really two ways that we can understand things. And we can have blacks in horror as one sort of category or bucket, and then black horror as a second category or bucket. And we've talked about a film that she would define as black horror, and that is very specifically Get Out, right? And it's going to be a film that is produced and written and features in a very significant way black identities and black experiences in a way that is different from where she's going to put Candyman, right? So she's going to put Candyman into the blacks in horror category, and largely because, and I agree with her assessment, that although Candyman kind of plays with this idea of almost giving us a sort of like monster with a heart of gold, right? All he wants to do is find love. He is killing black women. He is killing black people. And so she says that really a lot of this film is not so much about black cultures or experiences as it is, and this is a quote from her, in the end, this is a movie about celebrating white womanhood. Helen rejects Candyman's love, and vengefully Candyman is prepared to add another black victim to his belt, the infinite Anthony, burning him alive in a garbage heap. And then she says, down a little bit further, as a white woman, she can do what Candyman would not, terrorize those on the other side of the tracks. She's a woman scorned, exacting her revenge on Trevor. And so, again, if we have black horror and blacks in horror, she says that this film and a lot of films that are coming out in the 90s are going to be more of the blacks in horror, where it's not that Candyman doesn't have a significant role. It's not that we're not looking at things, but at the end of the day, this is not really a film about black people so much as it is a film about Helen, and Helen's sort of like forays on the other side of the tracks, and the ways that she is perhaps at first punished, but then ultimately like reified, right? For
immortalized.
Yeah, she's made into a goddess-like figure for having ultimately sort of intruded where maybe she didn't belong to.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key difference of, like, who's the story about. I mean, Get Out, there's no denying that is a story about black problems, particularly about the lead in that film. And in this film, yeah, you're exactly right. It's not Candyman's story. Candyman is a player in Helen's story. It's still ultimately, yeah. It's a beautiful distinction I think she makes, and it is incredibly important to think about when thinking about Candyman, and what if the story is being framed from ultimately Helen's perspective, what that you can ultimately take away from this film about race. Because ultimately it still is from a white person's perspective on race, and that's a very tricky subject.
It is. It's an incredibly tricky subject, and it's one that I think is why this film is something that you and I both say that we like sort of despite itself, right? Because in terms of its portrayals of race, we have this sort of exotification, right, of Cabrini green, like, ooh, yeah. Isn't that interesting, and how scary is that, and also, we have
it's very strange. I mean, you can't ignore the messaging of, like, when we open on the lecture. Anytime you see a lecture in a horror movie, you know that has to be important to the main themes of the film. That goes not just for lectures. It's just any like Shakespeare plays too. I'm talking about Ari Aster there.
Yeah, no, I have a theory that if you want to be a good teacher, there are like, you should learn from horror movie teachers because they always make it timely and relevant, right? And they get like right to the nugget. And so you're right. From the moment we have that lecture, you're like, okay, these are the themes that are going to be important.
Yeah, and so the themes in this that they're established in that lecture, it's like these are urban fears. This is like that crocodile example. It's the alligators are in the sewers, and it's like, no, that's just obviously that's not true. It's just an urban legend. It reveals what urban people who live in urban cities fear. So this movie is going to be about what urban people fear, and it's interesting who the villain then is in this film.
And it's interesting that again, you know, for all intents and purposes, Candyman, based on his backstory, right, should be the protector of his people, right? Mm-hmm. You know, he was tortured because of his love for a white woman by white men, and yet he spends his time terrorizing this black community of Cabrini Green. And so I think you're right that what we see here is this really sort of convoluted message about what is to be the source of fear as an urban legend. And it's strange because it should really be different if you're a resident of Cabrini Green versus if you're on the other side of the tracks. But we realize that in large part it's the same thing, right? It's the fear of this this person who, quote, doesn't know his place, right? Yeah. This person who is in a liminal space, because how much of this is about mirrors and bathrooms, right? And like spaces that are in between. And that's what makes him scary, right? Is that he lurks in the in-between places. He is unhappy, you know, being where he's, quote, again, quote, supposed to be. And that becomes a source of fear, for everyone, which is a really sort of weird and intriguing way to present this idea of what we should be afraid of.
I think it makes sense given when it was released in 1992, which would be right around the time when there was a lot of significant crime legislation going through the American Congress and sitting on the desk of the presidency, and there were lots of stop and frisk policies being put into place, this perpetuation of this black-on-black crime as being the most significant cause that led to the degradation of black lives in the society, rather than actually addressing any systematic inequality that has been perpetuated by the institutions that built America. So I think it makes sense that Candyman can only be a surface-level analysis or discussion of race, because it's not actually addressing the actual problem itself so much as it is just talking about it in the talking points of the 90s, which we now, yes, I think not everyone has realized, obviously, and nothing has changed, so, but it's harder to ignore now.
Yes, and what I think is really interesting about what you just said is that what this film kind of does is it says, you know, if this is something they fear, shouldn't you fear it twice as much, right? So that it's not like, okay, well, what this group of people fears is systematic racism, but what we're going to fear is the Candyman. Instead, it's, if they're scared of him, how could we, on the other side of the tracks, not be even more terrified? Mm-hmm. And that's a weird, to go to that kind of mirror thing, right? Like, you know, it's like seeing a reflection of a reflection. That's not, it just removes you that much further from what I think the film could be doing and I think would be doing today. And the other thing that I think is worth bringing up, because you mentioned, you know, that we have to ground this film in when it was released, and that is that, you know, we do have that real life example of the woman who was in her apartment. It was a locked room, and called the cops. And actually, her neighbor called the cops because she heard, screaming, and it turns out that idea that there could be a panel between apartments, right? Someone actually broke in, and the cops didn't come, right? And there was even that, like, heartbreaking sort of 911 call where they say, it's okay, the elevator is fixed, right? As though that would be the reason that the cops might not want to come, rather than them not coming because that neighborhood was sort of essentially on a sort of blackout list of, we just don't go there. And so this film may be problematic, but it's an accurate reflection of a very real and explicit set of interactions between, quote, us and them, us and the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just speaks as to why this film can't be black horror. It features a prominent black figure in horror, very prominent character. It's not like they're just paying lip service to black characters, but they're black characters in white America, and it's framed from the perspective of white America. And I think we can take this out of the abstract and put it into the concrete through the role of Helen. I mean, Helen is she's an incredible example of this. I mean, she's who her story is told from, and I was talking to you about this before we started recording. Helen is a deeply unlikable character for the same reasons that to reference an actual black horror, the white people in Get Out are deeply unlikable, because they're the type of white people who think that Obama gets elected, that's racism's gone, or, oh, I'm not a racist. It's like that line where Helen is like, isn't it weird that black people die over here and the police don't come, but when one white woman does, it's fine. And she's just like, oh, that is really bad, isn't it? Yeah. Let's ignore that, though. It's a throwaway line.
Right, she says that, but then, the moment that her sort of rights are impinged upon, right, like, oh, heaven forbid, and so you're absolutely correct that, and she does that repeatedly. It's not just that one time, right, with her friend Bernadette. She's constantly putting her friend in jeopardy long before, she actually ends up dying. She keeps putting her friend in jeopardy because she assumes that because she doesn't want to see the world as racially problematic in American culture, because she doesn't want to see disparity or whatever it is she doesn't want to see. That means everyone will see the world the way she wants to see it.
And I mean, she even takes advantage of, when she's going into that apartment complex, of the relationship of the police to the black community in America, where she's like, don't worry, they think we're cops, they're not going to follow us, they're not going to do anything to us, because she knows that the black community and the police don't have a particularly good relationship. There are numerous examples of police brutality, excessive force on predominantly the black community, and so she's using that knowledge to just help her cause. Yeah. It's just casual racism at its finest. It's not overt. It's nothing like it's like the difference between the Jim Crow laws in the South and gerrymandering in the North. They're both examples of racism. Just one is more overt and one is a little bit more well kept. But the result is still the denial of power to blacks in America.
One of the ways that I see that manifesting itself is through her inability to understand the significance of borders, or of like, what is my space or your space, until it proves inconvenient to her. So she has no problems traipsing into, first off, a crime scene, but second, she really just kind of walks into Anna Marie's home, and then she like starts helping her with the baby, like completely unwarranted. And this is before she goes in and kills the dog. But the moment that she walks into her home and sees Trevor's young student girlfriend person, she gets really offended. Admittedly, she should, because that's super gross. And just as a word to the wise, if you want to be a good person, you probably cannot start living with someone else while your wife has been committed within a month. But
also, it's just a little strange that it's the university professor with the university student, always creepy and disgusting. Don't do that.
Yeah, exactly. But you can tell when she goes in there that part of what is she finds so offensive, right, is not just that Trevor's hooking up with this girl, because she kind of knew that all along, right? It's that this girl is laying claim to her space.
Yeah.
Right? And because so much of this film is about this mirroring effect, it even says, like, oh, look, did you know that this complex is exactly the same as that complex? Because so much of this is about mirroring, we can't help but look at the fact that Helen has two very different standards, depending on which side of the mirror she's on.
And I mean, I think that this discussion of borders is particularly relevant in any film that is discussing race in any serious manner. And I think ultimately, you're right, it does come down in being in a very, very weird place. That the black communities should leave their problems over there, and Helen's perfectly fine using her white privilege to invade those black spaces and break down the borders there. She's really happy to do that. But that same level of border breaking cannot happen in her white spaces.
When we look at the issue of place, which is one of the things I personally find so interesting about this film, since I like to do things with place, I find it particularly interesting that our first introduction to the Candyman legend is even further removed from Helen's world by being set clearly in the suburbs, right?
Right.
We have pretty much white picket fence. I think it is actually a white picket fence, but we have this white home. We have a babysitter, which implies that, the parents are having to leave to go to something, right? Like they would if they lived in the suburbs, having to leave to go to the city to interact or whatever. It obviously implies a socio-economic status where you can afford to have someone take care of your child. But I think it's really interesting, and I'm not entirely sure if I know what to do with the fact that a film that is so much set in the cityscape begins our narrative in suburbia.
I mean, I think it could possibly be speaking to a phenomenon that is known by city planners of, like, white flight at night, where in the inner city, where it's about an equal amount of whites and blacks work inside the inner cities. However, at night, it's majority of black communities who still live in that city, and they're in the low-income housing sectors, the dilapidated sections of those cities, whereas you see a huge flight of white people at night going back out to the suburbs, retreating from the problems that are left in the city. Which I think that then that opening could then speak to the fact that we are not going to be fleeing away from the problems. We're going right into the problems.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it also helps us to, or it also helps to complicate, or tries to help complicate the sense of binaries in the film, right? Like, because it's trying to set up this idea that, he can come to anyone, he can come to any home. All you have to do is call him, and he will be there. But then quickly, again, the film, even as I think it tries to destroy some of these binaries, as Candyman, victim or villain, yes, right, as Helen, ultimately victim or hero, yes, right. I think that this film, this is one of the places where I think the film, I like it, despite the fact that it really struggles to break down the binaries, that I think it's trying to break down by setting them up, right? It makes such a point of saying, like, here's this side and here's this side, but it's trying to say, like, but it's permeable, right? That these boundaries can be crossed, and I'm not sure it's always capable of doing so, but I think that opening scene is trying to set us up for this sense of placelessness, right? That this can happen anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true. And, I mean, I think that in a way does show probably how progressive the film was for the 90s, and at least it was trying. And again, I feel like a lot of the things that it does wrong is just and that we perceive that is doing wrong when it comes to how it handles race, is just because the conversation in America around race has changed so much since the 90s. Things that were acceptable back in the 90s are not acceptable in the slightest anymore. And so I think it's just also, as much as the film does have a lot of these problems when it comes to race, a lot of them are not necessarily problems that are innate to the film itself, so much as it's our critique of the society that existed in the 90s and the culture that Candyman was in.
I think that's a good way to think about this film, particularly as it deals with issues of race. And I think that, again, one of the reasons I'm so excited for the new Candyman is that I'm hoping that we'll see this sort of progression and moving from the blacks in horror to the black horror. Mm-hmm. But I do, I do worry that, there is a small potential for the film to still remain in that blacks in horror category, precisely because, as you said before, we haven't completely eradicated all of these systems of oppression. In an article looking at the short story The Forbidden by Clive Barker, which is what Candyman is based on, Adam, and I apologize in advance for slaughtering his last name, Ochonicky, he refers to an idea by legal scholar Michelle Alexander, who describes this evolution in the United States from a racial caste system based entirely on exploitation, slavery, to one based largely on subordination, Jim Crow, to one defined by marginalization, mass incarceration. And I think that what's really interesting is that we kind of see all of that playing out to varying degrees in Candyman.
Yeah.
And, just in Candyman's story himself. But we also, interestingly, kind of see an attempt, whether intentional or not, to have a parallel path for Helen. So obviously she's not forced to be a slave, right? And obviously she's a white woman, and we've already talked about the fact that she's a privileged white woman at that. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I appreciate about this film is that it really is aware of the fact that she is still a marginalized individual within academia, within her house and home, within the sort of larger framework of intellectual sort of ambitions, right? There's the scene where she is, where the guy with the gross long hair like mansplains to her who Candyman is. He's like, "Do you know anything about Candyman?" And she mockingly says no, and then he like goes on for several minutes. But also, there's a lot of discussion about Trevor sharing things with his class before she's ready for them to. And so I think it's really interesting that this film really does look at this cycle and acknowledges that just because we're not at the darkest moments anymore doesn't mean that we're at the good moments, right? We're still in a place of marginalization. It's just a different form of it. I
think that is, I have two thoughts about that. I think the first one is I think that is another reason why it can't be black horror, because it's very much you're equating this struggle, the struggle that women do still face. I mean, there's no denying that women are still in a marginalized place, but they're different struggles. The
Absolutely.
Marginalization of against women and the marginalization and oppression that it's faced against the black communities all across America are very different struggles. And by choosing to focus and equate Helen's struggle as a white woman to the struggle of the black community, it does really kind of show which side the film is taking a stance on and which oppression it's saying is more important to be featured, I think. Which leads into why it can't be classified as black horror, and why I think it ultimately does. It makes Helen so unlikable, and it kind of comes off as feeling like the elite white people talking about race, which is very different than when black horror talks about black experiences and has commentary on race.
And you said that it prioritizes sort of her struggle, and I think to go back to something we were talking about at the beginning, right? Like, why is Candyman terrorizing the Black community, there's a way in which this film seems to suggest that, yes, we have these two groups of people that have been marginalized, but one of them, the Cabrini Green of the world, is just kind of to be expected. Of course there's going to be a Candyman. Of course there's going to be a drug pusher who, is carving into small children. But heaven forbid, right, that we have this monstrous experience with this other group, right? Because that has the potential to be threatened, right? It absolutely just depicts the Cabrini Green side of things as though that's just the way the world is. And then the Helen story is, but oh no, isn't it so traumatic that it's such that she's being, constantly beleaguered by this threat, and that's a really weird sort of problematic, as you said, message to be articulating.
Yeah, it's like it's showing which issue the film thinks is more important, and in a film that also wants you to have serious conversations, I think, about race, because I don't think anyone involved in this film actively thinks they're racist. However, their prioritization of the issues is a little bit dicey when it comes to race, admittedly. It's certainly not overt racism, but it is certainly not actively critiquing systematic racism and the entire wider culture that exists and to oppress and keep down blacks in America.
To go back to Coleman, right? This is a movie about celebrating white womanhood.
Yeah.
And it's celebrating it by first putting it in danger, and then by showing us, that she figuratively, if not literally, rises above, right?
Yeah. It's very similar to this, ongoing conversation in America about, the suburbans are being threatened. And you don't even have to finish that sentence, but it's so seeped into our culture that we know when people are making that claim, which groups they're talking about, which groups are being threatened and which groups are doing the threatening. Because it's another way of the us versus them mentality that we see. And yeah, it's a harmful mentality. It's a harmful way to see the world.
And yet, what I find really interesting is if you've been listening to us so far, which you all have, I'm not sure that you would feel like Anthony and I like the film, right? Based on what we've been saying. But there's so much that is fascinating. First, just the conversation that engenders the conversation that we've had. But there's other things that I think are so smartly done. Like, one of the things I find very fascinating is the overlay of religious ideology and concepts over this, from the music, which very much sounds like a church choir, to Candyman's constant discussion about his congregation, and the sort of that final shot of Helen that feels very much like she has been a martyr, right? And she's gone through a moment of transcendence and all that stuff, right? This is a film that it's the film that keeps on giving, right? Like, there are so many sort of different layers that it packs on, and what I enjoy about it is that it's not offering that grab bag of, does religion scare you? We're good. We have some of that in there. Really, it's just saying, it's more exploring an idea that actually the film and the filmmakers really wouldn't have been aware of, and that is Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, right? Where it's saying that we are located at the center of all of these different moments of identity, and it doesn't do it right because Kimberly Crenshaw was looking at Black feminism, right? So if this was really a film about intersectionality, it would have been about Bernadette and Anne Marie. But it is a film that seems to understand that thing that haunts us at night, the thing that we are terrified about when it comes to urban legends that seem so simple on the surface. Obviously, you're afraid of alligators. Well, that's not actually what you're afraid of. You're really afraid of nature, a system that you don't understand, the sewer system, exotic things being brought in, right? I mean, there's so many other things. And so I like the fact that Candyman proves that urban legends are at their most complicated when they seem to be at their simplest.
Yeah, and I think this idea of religion and the religious overlay relates back to this idea brought up by Emile Durkheim, a sociologist, of the sacred, and in this essay that he wrote about the elementary forms of religious life, talked about how religion is present in all cultures, and essentially religion is really just the dividing up into sacred and not sacred, so that cultures know what to orient themselves around to preserve, so that they can uphold and preserve the sacred. And I think a lot of this movie it's very smart in that it's a framing around religious ideas and this notion of like, this is the sacred, what's happening to the sacred right now. These things that we as society have collectively decided are good and sacred, are they all good and sacred? Maybe not. Are we going to try to protect them? That this film certainly does seem to want to try to do that and uphold it.
I've looked at, and specifically with the film Martyrs in an article, and we've talked about before, this connection between the framework used to understand the sacred, to understand transcendence, and the amount of taboo and suffering and destabilization that happens within those frameworks. And I think that what's interesting is that without ever doing so explicitly, the film allows us to begin to see that some of these ways that we understand racial identities is informed by how we understand, like you said, issues of the sacred and religion. And so one of the ways in which I think this film succeeds as a narrative about race is by showing us that race is not simply an issue of appearance, right? It is a geographic, it is a socio-economic, it is a religious, it is a cultural, it is all of these different layers built on top of each other in a way that the moment you try to pull one out, right, like it's like a Jenga, right? Like the moment you pull one out, the whole thing's going to come tumbling down because it's all built on top of each other.
Yeah. And I think my closing thoughts on it is that I think that Candyman is so incredible at identifying so many interesting ideas and problems that are present in society, and just playing them out in the context of almost like the real 1992. And so we see how 1992 responded to these problems. And yet, that's also the same reason why it's frustrating, because it's addressing these problems within the system, and within the system that's deeply entrenched in systematic racism and inequality. And thus, that's why I can only like the film in spite of itself, because it brings up so many interesting problems and areas to think about, but ultimately, I don't think that it goes far enough, and it doesn't do an incredible job at I don't know what I was going to say. It doesn't do an incredible job of something. So following, I don't know.
The end.
I don't know. I lost it. I totally lost it.
It was going somewhere beautiful. When I think about this film, the way for me that it works is by, as you said, acknowledging that it is somehow managing to simultaneously address and ignore the big issues. And for me, this film works if I think of it as itself an urban legend. That it doesn't entirely have to make sense, because urban legends are not about they're about a type of cause and effect that is almost separate from reality, right? In the real world, if you go, necking with your significant other in a parked car, someone with a hook is not going to kill you. That's not how cause and effect works in the real world. But in urban legends, there's a whole different logic. It's like, of course that's what would happen. Like the moment you hear that, and then she invited a boy over and it wasn't the boy she was dating, you're like, oh, guess you deserve to die, right? And I feel that this film succeeds because the entire time everything makes such logical sense only until you start to poke at it, right? It feels very dreamlike, the entire thing. And I know a lot of people, a lot of students ask about the ending, right? Like, what are we supposed to do with the fact that now she's Candyman or Helen, right? But what are we supposed to do with the fact that she is she going to terrorize the black people who now kind of worship her, or is she going to only terrorize people on the other side of the tracks, or was it just a one and done with Trevor? And again, I think it only makes sense if you treat it from that sort of urban legend logic of, everything is cyclical. When one thing ends, another thing will take its place always. That binaries simultaneously exist but are also broken. And I think that's really interesting because I feel like I've criticized other films, and I'm thinking particularly of Jordan Peele's Us. I've criticized other films for, I think, trying to do something similar, right? Trying to have that feel of like it's all these different layers. But I think that Candyman just knew from the beginning that it was going to have this surreal creation, visually, narratively, that I don't think films like Us were successful at doing.
Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion of Candyman. We're going to be taking a bit of a departure next week. We're going in a completely different direction than what we were talking about this time. We were going to be talking about Evil Dead 2.
Although I would argue that one thing they have in common is that you have to like them almost despite themselves a little bit, right? Like Evil Dead 2, I like despite the fact that it's a more than a little goobery at times. So there's something to be said for that. But yes, please join us for our next episode, Evil Dead 2. In the meantime, be sure to
follow our social media pages, which are all in the description of this podcast, and go on to wherever you get your podcast and leave us a like and comment. It really helps us to expand our reach, and as always, share this podcast with your friends, and thank you so much for listening.
And whatever you do, don't repeat Candyman in front of the mirror tonight.
You could do it 4 times, but don't push it with 5.